You really thought you could walk into my courtroom and take what you never earned. Victoria Hayes' voice rang through the polished courtroom with effortless confidence, carrying just enough amusement to draw a wave of restrained laughter from the gallery. She sat at the plaintiff's table in a tailored ivory suit that looked as though it had been chosen to impress cameras rather than judges, a string of pearls resting neatly against her collarbone, her posture radiating absolute certainty. Across the room, Charlotte Hayes remained standing beside her attorney without reacting. At 31, she wore a simple navy dress beneath a charcoal blazer, her blonde hair gathered into a modest knot, her only accessory a slim leather portfolio worn smooth by years of careful handling. She neither defended herself nor acknowledged the whispers spreading across the courtroom like wind across dry leaves. Judge Eleanor Brooks adjusted her glasses, allowing the room a moment to settle before speaking. Mrs. Hayes, you'll have your opportunity to testify. For now, please allow counsel to proceed. Victoria smiled politely toward the bench before casting another glance at Charlotte, one filled with practiced pity rather than open hostility. Your Honor, I'm only trying to understand why someone who abandoned this family suddenly believes she deserves control over an estate she had nothing to build. The words landed exactly as she intended. Several spectators exchanged knowing looks. A local reporter quietly scribbled into a notebook. Even one of the younger clerks lowered his eyes toward Charlotte with unmistakable sympathy, assuming she had arrived only to delay the inevitable. Charlotte simply folded her hands together. Her expression never hardened. If anything, it became calmer, as though every insult merely confirmed something she had already accepted long ago. Sunlight filtered through the tall courthouse windows, painting long golden rectangles across the hardwood floor while the old wall clock ticked with relentless precision. Somewhere beyond the heavy oak doors, distant footsteps echoed through the marble hallway, but inside courtroom 4, every sound seemed swallowed by anticipation. Victoria leaned back comfortably, convinced she already owned the ending to today's story. Her attorney, Michael Reynolds, rose with measured confidence and approached the center of the courtroom. Your Honor, the evidence will show my client faithfully cared for Richard Hayes throughout his illness, while Miss Hayes chose distance over responsibility. We intend to demonstrate there is no legal or moral basis for her claims. Judge Brooks nodded. Proceed. Michael placed several organized binders onto the evidence table with quiet satisfaction. Each document appeared carefully labeled, every page tabbed with colorful markers that projected preparation and certainty. Victoria watched Charlotte closely, waiting for panic to appear. None came. Instead, Charlotte slowly opened her weathered leather portfolio and removed a single cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax. It bore no law firm logo, no court filing stamp, only Richard Hayes' unmistakable signature written across the front in steady black ink. She rested it gently on the table without a word. Victoria laughed softly beneath her breath. Still holding onto one of Richard's sentimental letters? She asked with a dismissive smile. You always did confuse memories with ownership. Charlotte finally lifted her eyes to meet hers. There was no anger in them, no resentment, only a quiet certainty that seemed strangely out of place amid the growing tension. Then she spoke for the very first time since entering the courtroom. My father never confused the two. The silence that followed Charlotte's answer settled over the courtroom with surprising weight. Even Victoria's confident smile lingered a second too long before she leaned back in her chair and folded her arms. To her, the young woman standing across the room was still the insecure daughter who had never fought back, the quiet observer who had always stepped aside whenever conflict filled the house. Richard Hayes had built one of the largest privately owned commercial real estate companies in the state over 4 decades, beginning with a single warehouse outside Columbus and expanding into office parks, shopping centers, and apartment communities across 3 states. Newspapers had called him disciplined, relentless, and remarkably private. Those who worked beside him knew another version of the man. Richard rarely raised his voice. He watched. He remembered. He trusted actions long before promises. After his diagnosis, he became even quieter. While board members speculated about succession and financial reporters guessed who would inherit the empire, Richard stopped discussing the future altogether. Victoria interpreted his silence as confidence in her. Charlotte understood it differently. Michael Reynolds cleared his throat before continuing his presentation. Large photographs appeared on the courtroom display showing Victoria attending charity galas with Richard, accompanying him to award ceremonies, and standing beside him during ribbon cuttings for new developments. Every image reinforced the same message. She looked like the devoted wife who had stood beside a successful businessman through his final years. Michael spoke with polished precision. He described long evenings at the hospital, medical appointments, family obligations, and countless sacrifices. Every sentence painted Victoria as the natural guardian of Richard's legacy. Members of the gallery nodded almost instinctively. It was an easy story to believe because it required no uncomfortable questions. Charlotte remained motionless. She did not challenge a single photograph. She did not interrupt a single claim. Benjamin Carter quietly observed the reactions filling the room. He noticed every sympathetic glance directed toward Victoria and every doubtful expression aimed at his client. Years inside courtrooms had taught him that first impressions often became invisible evidence, more persuasive than documents if left unchallenged. He leaned toward Charlotte and spoke softly enough that only she could hear. "You are doing exactly what your father expected." Charlotte answered without taking her eyes off the judge. "He always said people reveal themselves when they believe they have already won." Benjamin gave the slightest nod before sitting back. Across the aisle, Victoria noticed the exchange and smiled. With renewed confidence, she believed they were comforting each other because the case was slipping away. She could almost imagine the headlines waiting outside the courthouse. "Wealthy widow defeats estranged daughter in inheritance battle." The narrative fit perfectly. Judge Brooks reviewed several exhibits before placing them neatly aside. "Counselor Reynolds," she said calmly, "your evidence establishes family history, but this court will ultimately decide ownership through governing legal instruments, not public appearances." Michael answered immediately, "Of course, Your Honor. That is precisely why we are confident." Judge Brooks turned toward Benjamin. "Counselor Carter, does the defense intend to challenge the authenticity of these exhibits?" Benjamin slowly rose to his feet, buttoned his jacket, and glanced once toward the sealed envelope resting on Charlotte's table. "No, Your Honor," he replied with remarkable composure. "In fact, we believe every photograph should remain part of the record because they explain exactly why Richard Hayes spent the last 6 months of his life preparing one final document that no one in this courtroom has seen." The faint rustle of legal pads and turning pages was the only sound inside the courtroom as Benjamin Carter reached for the sealed envelope. Unlike the thick binders stacked before Michael Reynolds, this single document seemed almost insignificant. Its edges had yellowed slightly with age, and the dark blue wax seal remained perfectly intact despite months of storage. Benjamin held it carefully, almost reverently, before walking toward the bench. Every pair of eyes followed the envelope. Victoria watched with visible amusement, convinced the dramatic presentation was nothing more than a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. She leaned toward Michael and whispered something that drew a confident smile from him. Neither appeared concerned. Judge Eleanor Brooks accepted the envelope without opening it immediately. She examined the handwritten signature across the front. "Richard Hayes." The ink had faded just enough to reveal it had not been written recently. Beneath his signature appeared a single sentence in neat block letters. "To be opened only upon my death during any legal dispute concerning the control of my estate." The judge looked up. "Counselor Carter, can you establish the chain of custody?" Benjamin answered without hesitation. "Yes, Your Honor." This document remained in the secure possession of Richard Hayes' estate planning attorney from the day it was signed until it was transferred directly into this court's evidence vault. He handed another folder to the court clerk. Inside were notarized affidavits, storage records, and signatures documenting every transfer. The clerk quickly reviewed each page before passing them to Judge Brooks. The judge nodded quietly as she compared dates and official seals. Michael Reynolds immediately stood. "Your Honor, we have not yet examined those supporting documents." Benjamin remained composed. "You received certified copies through discovery 3 weeks ago." Michael paused only briefly before recovering his confidence. "We simply reserve our right to object if necessary." Judge Brooks looked toward him calmly. "Your objection is noted." Victoria shifted in her chair, the first hint of impatience replacing her earlier certainty. She had expected Charlotte to argue emotionally, perhaps to challenge memories or family relationships. Instead, every response from the defense relied entirely on procedure. No raised voices. No accusations. Only carefully prepared documents appearing one after another. It was not the courtroom battle she had anticipated. Charlotte quietly watched the envelope resting on the bench. For a fleeting moment her thoughts drifted backward to one rainy afternoon nearly 7 months before Richard Hayes passed away. The office windows overlooked rows of downtown buildings disappearing beneath gray clouds. Her father had been noticeably thinner, but his eyes remained as sharp as ever. He had rested one hand on the same cream-colored envelope before sliding it across his mahogany desk. "People usually fight over what they think belongs to them," he had said softly. Very few stopped to ask who was trusted to protect it. Charlotte had wanted to ask what he meant, but he gently raised one finger before she could speak. There will come a day when explaining will not matter. Only this will. The memory faded as the courtroom returned around her. Judge Brooks carefully broke the wax seal with a letter opener borrowed from the clerk's desk. The quiet snap echoed through the room far louder than anyone expected. Even the spectators sitting in the last row leaned forward almost instinctively. Victoria forced a small laugh, attempting to dismiss the growing tension. "Probably another sentimental farewell," she murmured. Richard always enjoyed making simple things sound mysterious. Charlotte offered no reply. Benjamin stood with his hands folded behind his back while the judge slowly unfolded the first page. Her eyes moved across the opening lines with practiced efficiency. Then, almost imperceptibly, her expression changed. The confidence of routine judicial review gave way to something far more deliberate. She stopped reading, looked directly at Benjamin Carter, and asked in a measured voice that instantly silenced the entire courtroom. "Counselor, are you informing this court that Richard Hayes intentionally separated ownership from control before his death?" Benjamin Carter met the judge's question with the same calm expression he had carried since the hearing began. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied. Richard Hayes intentionally created two separate legal realities. One determined who would inherit assets. The other determined who would control them. A murmur rolled across the courtroom before Judge Eleanor Brooks lifted her eyes from the document. The room immediately fell silent again. Victoria slowly straightened in her chair, the confidence that had carried her through the morning beginning to tighten into visible curiosity. Michael Reynolds stepped forward. "Your Honor, estate planning frequently separates administrative duties from ownership. That alone changes nothing." Benjamin nodded politely. "Ordinarily, I would agree." He waited just long enough for every eye in the courtroom to settle on him before continuing. "This situation is not ordinary." Judge Brooks lowered her gaze back to the first page and continued reading in silence. The clock mounted high. On the courtroom wall marked each passing second with deliberate precision. No one shifted. No one whispered. Even the reporters stopped typing. Whatever the judge was reading demanded complete attention. Charlotte remained perfectly still. She had not looked toward Victoria once since the hearing began. Instead, her attention rested quietly on the polished wooden railing separating counsel from the bench, almost as though she had rehearsed this moment many times in her mind. Across the aisle, Victoria's fingers began tapping lightly against the armrest before she noticed the habit and forced herself to stop. She smiled again, but this time it appeared practiced rather than effortless. "Richard loved complicated paperwork," she said with a soft laugh directed toward no one in particular. "He always believed every problem needed 3 attorneys and 6 signatures." A few uneasy smiles appeared among the spectators, but they faded almost immediately when Judge Brooks finally spoke again. "This letter references an attachment identified as Schedule D." Benjamin opened another slim folder. "Permission to approach, Your Honor." "Granted." He handed the document to the court clerk, who immediately delivered it to the bench. Judge Brooks aligned both pages side by side. Her eyes moved slowly between them, comparing dates, signatures, and legal descriptions. Michael Reynolds watched carefully, searching for an opening. "Your Honor, unless these documents alter the terms of the will itself, they cannot invalidate my client's ownership interests." Judge Brooks answered without looking up. "No one has suggested they do." That single sentence seemed to drain the certainty from Michael's posture. Benjamin remained silent. He understood something every experienced trial attorney eventually learned. The strongest evidence rarely needed dramatic explanation. It simply needed to be read. The judge reached the second page and paused again. Her expression did not reveal surprise, but it revealed concentration, the unmistakable look of someone discovering an answer hidden beneath assumptions everyone else had accepted. Charlotte remembered another quiet evening in her father's study. The fireplace had burned low while financial reports covered the desk. Richard had removed his reading glasses and looked directly at her. "Most people think control comes from owning something," he had said. "That is rarely true. The person trusted to make decisions holds the real responsibility. Ownership can be transferred. Trust cannot." At the time, Charlotte believed he was speaking philosophically. Only months later did she understand he had been explaining the future without ever naming it. Back inside the courtroom, Judge Brooks carefully placed both documents on the bench and folded her hands together. She looked first toward Victoria, then toward Charlotte. "The court now understands why these proceedings have been framed incorrectly from the beginning," she said evenly. Victoria frowned. "Incorrectly?" The judge nodded once. "Everyone entered this courtroom believing this case was about inheritance." She lifted the second document slightly above the bench. "According to the evidence before me, Richard Hayes designed it to be about authority." Victoria stared at the document in Judge Eleanor Brooks' hands as though the words themselves had suddenly changed languages. "Authority," she repeated quietly, almost laughing at the idea. "Authority over what?" Judge Brooks lowered the papers onto the bench with deliberate care before answering. "According to Schedule D and the accompanying declaration signed by Richard Hayes, authority over every operational decision involving the Hayes estate, including all trusts, investment accounts, commercial properties, business voting rights, and preservation directives." The words settled over the courtroom like a heavy curtain. Michael Reynolds rose immediately. "Your Honor, my client remains the primary beneficiary under the will." "That appears to be correct," Judge Brooks replied evenly. "However, beneficiaries do not automatically possess managerial authority when a trust instrument states otherwise." Benjamin Carter stepped forward. "With the court's permission, I would like the clerk to read the relevant provision into the record." Judge Brooks nodded once. The courtroom clerk accepted the document and adjusted her glasses before reading aloud in a clear, measured voice. "I, Richard Allen Hayes, being of sound mind, appoint my daughter, Charlotte Elaine Hayes, as sole lifetime executor and managing trustee of the Hayes Legacy Trust. No beneficiary, family member, spouse, successor, or corporate officer shall overrule, replace, suspend, or interfere with her administrative authority except by written instruction personally executed by me during my lifetime." Every sentence seemed to remove another layer of certainty from Victoria's expression. The confidence that had defined her posture all morning slowly disappeared. She turned toward Michael. "He never mentioned any of this." Michael remained focused on the documents, searching every page as though another paragraph might undo what had just been read. Benjamin quietly waited before speaking again. "Please continue." The clerk turned the page. "The position granted to Charlotte Hayes exists independently from inheritance and shall remain effective regardless of the final distribution of personal assets." A reporter in the front row lowered his notebook and looked directly toward Charlotte. Moments earlier, she had appeared to be an overlooked daughter challenging impossible odds. Now the room was beginning to understand that Richard Hayes had designed something entirely different. Charlotte never celebrated. She simply listened with the same quiet composure that had carried her through every accusation. She remembered sitting beside her father during one of his final visits to the company headquarters. Employees had greeted Richard warmly, but nearly every department manager had turned instinctively toward Charlotte when questions arose. She had assumed they were simply being polite because she was his daughter. Richard had smiled after one meeting ended. "Did you notice something?" he had asked. Charlotte had shaken her head. "I answered only one question today," he had said. "You answered every important one." She had laughed, believing he was encouraging her confidence. Only now did she realize he had already been preparing everyone around them for a future she did not yet recognize. Back inside the courtroom, Victoria slowly stood. "This cannot be right," she said, her voice no longer carrying the effortless certainty from earlier that morning. "I was his wife. Judge Brooks met her eyes with calm professionalism. "No one is questioning your marriage, Mrs. Hayes." Victoria swallowed carefully. "Then how could he leave me everything, but allow someone else to control everything?" Benjamin answered before the judge could speak. "Because Richard Hayes understood that ownership answers one question, while stewardship answers another." Judge Brooks glanced once more at the signed declaration before looking toward Charlotte. At this stage, the documentary evidence strongly indicates that Richard Hayes intentionally separated financial benefit from decision-making. She paused briefly before adding the sentence that changed the atmosphere of the entire courtroom. "Miss Hayes, it appears your father entrusted you with the one responsibility no amount of inheritance alone could ever purchase." The courtroom seemed farther away than ever as Charlotte lowered her eyes for a single quiet moment. Judge Eleanor Brooks continued reviewing the documents before her, but the words faded into the background as memories she had carefully locked away for years returned with remarkable clarity. They were not memories of board meetings or financial reports. They were ordinary moments that had never seemed important until now. 6 years earlier, Richard Hayes had invited Charlotte to breakfast at a small neighborhood diner nearly 20 miles outside the city. It was the kind of place where the waitress greeted regular customers by name and fresh coffee arrived before anyone asked. Richard could have chosen any exclusive restaurant in the state, yet he preferred the little corner booth overlooking the parking lot. That morning he had left his phone in the truck and spent nearly 2 hours asking Charlotte questions that had nothing to do with money. He wanted to know how she solved disagreements at work. He asked what she would do if two honest people expected opposite decisions. He asked whether protecting a family business sometimes required disappointing family members. Charlotte answered each question as honestly as she could, believing her father was simply sharing another life lesson. Richard listened far more than he spoke. When breakfast ended, he smiled quietly and said, "You never answered with the easiest solution. You answered with the one you believed you could live with tomorrow." At the time, she thought nothing of it. Months later, he invited her to walk through one of his oldest apartment communities. The buildings were not glamorous. Paint had faded in places, sidewalks showed years of wear, and several maintenance trucks sat near the leasing office. Richard stopped every few minutes to greet employees by their first names. He knew whose daughter had earned a college scholarship, whose wife had recovered from surgery, and whose grandson had just been born. Charlotte watched people smile the moment they saw him. On the drive home, she asked why he remembered so many personal details. Richard rested one hand on the steering wheel before answering. "Buildings are easy to replace. Trust is not." During another visit, he handed Charlotte a folder filled with proposals from investors eager to purchase several shopping centers. The offers promised extraordinary profits. Charlotte spent the evening reading every page before returning the folder untouched the following morning. Richard looked surprised. "You did not choose one." Charlotte shook her head. "None of them promised to keep the employees." Richard leaned back in his chair without saying a word. After several quiet seconds, he finally nodded once. "That was the only answer I hoped you would give." He never praised her directly after that conversation. He simply placed the folder into a locked cabinet. Years passed, and similar moments quietly accumulated. Richard never announced that he was testing her judgment. He never called them lessons. He simply watched how she treated receptionists, accountants, property managers, maintenance supervisors, and tenants who believed no one important would ever notice them. Charlotte never realized every ordinary decision was becoming part of a much larger picture. Back inside the courtroom, Benjamin Carter broke the silence. "Your Honor, the documents explain who received authority. They do not fully explain why." Judge Brooks looked toward him. "Does the estate contain additional evidence addressing Richard Hayes' intent?" Benjamin nodded respectfully. "Yes, Your Honor." Richard Hayes recorded a private statement for the trustee file, to be introduced only if his decision was challenged in court. Victoria slowly turned toward Charlotte, uncertainty replacing every trace of confidence she had carried into the courtroom. For the first time since the hearing began, she was no longer asking what Richard had done. She was beginning to wonder why he had trusted Charlotte more than anyone else. Benjamin Carter reached into his briefcase once more and removed a small black flash drive sealed inside a transparent evidence pouch. Unlike the earlier documents, this piece of evidence seemed almost ordinary, yet the atmosphere inside the courtroom shifted the moment it appeared. Judge Eleanor Brooks accepted the pouch and examined the attached evidence label. It listed the date of deposit, the attorney who had witnessed the recording, and Richard Hayes' notarized authorization permitting its release only if the authority granted to Charlotte Hayes was challenged in court. "Has the authenticity of this recording been stipulated?" the judge asked. Michael Reynolds glanced toward Victoria before answering. "We have no evidence suggesting it is not authentic, Your Honor." Judge Brooks nodded toward the court clerk, who connected the drive to the courtroom audio system. The speakers gave a soft electronic tone before silence settled once again across the room. Then Richard Hayes' familiar voice filled the courtroom. It sounded older than Charlotte remembered, slower than during his healthiest years, yet every word carried the calm confidence that had guided an entire company for decades. "If you are listening to this recording," Richard began, "then someone believes my decision requires an explanation. I have never enjoyed explaining my judgment, but I understand why this moment may come." Every person in the courtroom remained perfectly still. Even the reporters stopped writing. Richard continued, "The question is not who loved me more. The question is who understood what I spent my life building." Victoria lowered her eyes. Richard's voice remained steady. "Many people will believe the Hayes estate is made of buildings, bank accounts, and investment portfolios. They are mistaken. Those things are only tools. The real estate is trust earned over 40 years from employees, tenants, partners, and families who depended on promises being kept." Charlotte closed her eyes briefly as memories of her father blended naturally with the recording. Richard paused before speaking again. "I did not choose Charlotte because she is my daughter. If family alone determined leadership, I would never have built anything worth protecting. I chose her because she repeatedly made difficult decisions that cost her personally while protecting people who had nothing to offer in return." Several members of the gallery exchanged surprised glances. Richard's words continued without hesitation. "She recommended repairs before profits. She defended employees when replacing them would have been cheaper. She refused offers that increased revenue while placing communities at unnecessary risk. She never knew I was evaluating her because character shown for recognition is not character at all." Victoria slowly looked toward Charlotte for the first time without resentment. Instead, confusion and disbelief mixed across her face as years of assumptions quietly unraveled. Richard's voice softened slightly. "If my wife is hearing this, I hope she understands something important. This decision was never intended as punishment. Benefiting from what I built and protecting what I built are different responsibilities. They require different strengths." Michael Reynolds lowered his pen onto the table. There were no objections left to raise against a man calmly explaining his own intentions in unmistakable language. Richard continued, "Charlotte never asked for control. That is precisely why she can be trusted with it. People who chase authority often misunderstand it. Authority is not permission to command. It is the obligation to serve when every decision disappoints someone." The final seconds of the recording arrived with remarkable simplicity. "If you still question my judgment after hearing these words, then allow history to answer instead of me. Watch how Charlotte protects what I leave behind. That will be all the explanation anyone ever needs." The recording ended. The speakers fell silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound remaining inside the courtroom was the quiet ticking of the old clock, as every person present realized Richard Hayes had not merely appointed a trustee. He had revealed the standard by which every claim made that morning would now be measured. The silence lingered long after Richard Hayes' recorded voice faded from the courtroom speakers. Judge Eleanor Brooks allowed the moment to settle naturally before removing her glasses and placing them carefully on the bench. Years of presiding over complicated estate disputes had taught her that facts often ended arguments more effectively than emotion ever could. She looked first toward Benjamin Carter, then toward Michael Reynolds. Does either party dispute the authenticity or intent of the recording that has just been entered into evidence? Michael remained standing, but the certainty that had defined his arguments throughout the morning had disappeared. He reviewed the documents one final time before quietly answering, "No, Your Honor. We do not dispute that Richard Hayes intended Charlotte Hayes to serve as managing trustee." Victoria turned toward him with visible disbelief. "That is it," she whispered. "You are simply accepting this." Michael lowered his voice. "The evidence no longer supports the position we presented." Victoria slowly shook her head. struggling to reconcile everything she had believed with everything now sitting before the court. She had entered the hearing convinced that ownership alone guaranteed authority. Richard had anticipated that assumption years earlier. Judge Brooks folded her hands together. The court has reviewed the trust declaration, the supporting schedules, the notarized affidavits, and the recorded statement of Richard Hayes. Together they establish a consistent legal intention that cannot be ignored. She looked directly toward Charlotte. Miss Hayes, under the governing trust documents, your authority extends to the administration of every protected asset within the Hayes Legacy Trust. Benjamin respectfully added, including operational oversight of all commercial properties, investment management decisions, board voting authority, charitable distributions, and preservation obligations established by Richard Hayes. Judge Brooks nodded. That is the court's understanding as well. Victoria's shoulders slowly lowered. Then what exactly belongs to me? She asked quietly. The question no longer carried frustration. It sounded like someone honestly searching for solid ground after discovering everything familiar had shifted beneath her feet. Judge Brooks answered with calm precision. According to the will, you remain a beneficiary entitled to the distributions specifically assigned to you. However, those distributions do not include unilateral authority to liquidate trust assets, appoint executives, dispose of company property, alter governance, or override decisions reserved exclusively for the managing trustee. Benjamin opened one final binder and handed a summary schedule to opposing counsel. Michael read the document in silence before placing it on the table. There was nothing misleading hidden inside its pages. Every limitation had been drafted years earlier. Every signature had been properly witnessed. Every procedure had been followed exactly as Richard Hayes intended. Around the courtroom, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The spectators who had once viewed Charlotte as an outsider now watched her with quiet respect. The reporters who had prepared stories about a dramatic inheritance battle quietly rewrote their opening paragraphs. Even the court clerk glanced briefly toward Charlotte before continuing the official record, recognizing that the hearing had become something far different from what anyone expected when the doors first opened that morning. Judge Brooks picked up her pen. The plaintiff's petition requesting exclusive administrative control over the Hayes estate is denied. The words echoed softly through the courtroom. This court recognizes Charlotte Hayes as the lawful managing trustee and executor in accordance with the governing trust instruments executed by Richard Hayes. No applause followed. No celebration interrupted the dignity of the proceedings. Only a deep, unmistakable silence settled over the room as the legal reality became final. Victoria lowered herself back into her chair without speaking. Across the aisle, Charlotte remained exactly where she had stood since the hearing began. She neither smiled nor expressed triumph. She simply accepted the responsibility her father had entrusted to her years before, understanding that the greatest victories rarely sounded like victories at all. The courtroom emptied slowly, not because anyone had been instructed to remain, but because few people seemed ready to leave. Conversations that had begun with quiet confidence ended in thoughtful silence. Reporters gathered their notebooks without the excitement that usually followed a public legal victory. They had arrived expecting another inheritance dispute driven by wealth and resentment. They left having witnessed something far less common. They had watched a father's judgment outlast every assumption made about his family. Judge Eleanor Brooks signed the final order, handed it to the clerk, and looked once more toward Charlotte Hayes. Miss Hayes, she said warmly, your responsibilities begin today. I trust you understand what this court has recognized. Charlotte gave a respectful nod. Yes, Your Honor. I do. There was nothing more to add. Benjamin Carter quietly organized the remaining documents into his briefcase before extending his hand toward Charlotte. She accepted it with genuine gratitude. Your father prepared for this day better than anyone I have ever represented, Benjamin said softly. Charlotte smiled for the first time all morning, though it was a small, reflective smile rather than one of celebration. He prepared me long before he prepared the paperwork. Benjamin nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Across the aisle, Victoria remained seated for another minute after everyone else had begun leaving. The confidence that had carried her into the courthouse had been replaced by something quieter, something closer to reflection than defeat. She looked toward Charlotte as though seeing her for the first time instead of seeing only the role she had imagined for years. Charlotte walked over without hesitation. Neither woman spoke immediately. The silence between them no longer felt hostile. It felt honest. Victoria finally lowered her eyes. "I thought he trusted me because he left me so much," she admitted quietly. Charlotte answered with remarkable gentleness. "He did trust you." Victoria looked up, confused. Charlotte continued. "He trusted you with the life the two of you built together. He trusted me with protecting the future after he was gone. Those were different responsibilities." Victoria took a slow breath and nodded almost imperceptibly. There was no argument left to make because Richard himself had answered every question that mattered. Charlotte picked up the weathered leather portfolio she had carried into court that morning. It felt no heavier than before, yet everything inside now carried the full weight of her father's confidence. As she stepped outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun reflected from the glass buildings across the street, filling the plaza with warm light. Employees from Hayes Development waited quietly near the entrance. No one applauded. No one rushed forward with congratulations. One by one, they simply greeted Charlotte with respectful smiles and returned to discussing work that still needed to be done. It was exactly the kind of welcome Richard Hayes would have appreciated. Life moved forward because responsibility always did. Charlotte paused at the top of the courthouse steps and looked toward the city skyline her father had spent decades helping shape. She remembered one final conversation shortly before his passing. Richard had looked out across those same buildings and said, "If people remember my name, that will fade. If they remember how they were treated because of the choices you make, that will last much longer." Only now did she fully understand those words. She was never meant to inherit a fortune. She was meant to protect a promise. With quiet determination, she walked toward the waiting employees, ready to make the first decision not as someone who had won an argument, but as someone entrusted with a legacy that could only survive through integrity. In the end, Richard Hayes had left behind something far more valuable than wealth. He left proof that true leadership is never measured by the power to possess, but by the wisdom to preserve, because the greatest inheritance is not ownership. It is the trust that someone believes you will do what is right long after they are gone.